The morning sun
Soldiers,
cast
the
long
time has
shadows across
come.
the small
We
town
must
of
stay
Millbrook
united
as
and
Sarah
move forward
Martinez
as
walked down
one.
the main street. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore ordinary jeans and a plain t-shirt. To anyone watching, she looked like any other woman in her early 30s going about her daily business. No one would guess that underneath her quiet exterior lay years of intense military training and classified operations. Sarah had moved to Millbrook 3 months ago, seeking the peace and anonymity that small-town life could offer. After 15 years of service in the Navy, including 8 years as a Navy SEAL, she had earned the right to disappear into civilian life. Her service record was sealed, her achievements classified, and her rank as general known only to a select few within the military hierarchy. To the people of Millbrook, she was simply Sarah, the new woman who had bought the old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The transition to civilian life hadn't been easy. Sarah found herself waking at dawn out of habit, her body still programmed for the rigid schedule of military life. She missed the camaraderie of her unit, the clear objectives, and the sense of purpose that came with serving her country. But she also appreciated the quiet mornings, the lack of constant vigilance, and the freedom to make simple choices like what to eat for breakfast or whether to take a walk without it being part of a mission briefing. On this particular morning, Sarah was heading to the local hardware store. The farmhouse needed repairs, and she had decided to tackle them herself rather than hire someone. Physical work helped her adjust to civilian life, giving her hands something to do while her mind processed the changes. The store owner, an elderly man named Frank, had been helpful during her previous visits, though she could tell he was curious about her background. "Morning, Sarah," Frank called out as she entered the store. "What brings you in today?" "I need to fix the front steps," she replied, examining the selection of lumber. "They're starting to sag." Frank nodded and walked over to help her select the right materials. As they talked, Sarah noticed a commotion outside. Through the store window, she could see a group of teenagers gathered around something in the parking lot. Their voices were getting louder, and their body language suggested trouble brewing. "Excuse me," Sarah said to Frank, stepping outside to get a better look. In the center of the group, she saw a young girl, maybe 16 years old, sitting on the ground with tears streaming down her face. The teenagers surrounding her were laughing and pointing, their phones out recording whatever was happening. Sarah's military training kicked in immediately, her eyes scanning the situation for threats and her mind calculating the best approach. The girl on the ground had obviously been the victim of some kind of prank or bullying. Her hair looked like it had been cut unevenly, with chunks missing in places. Someone had clearly taken scissors to it without her permission, leaving her looking disheveled and humiliated. The other teenagers continued to laugh and take pictures, completely oblivious to the real harm they were causing. Sarah approached slowly, her training telling her to assess the full situation before acting. She could hear fragments of what the bullies were saying, cruel comments about the girl's appearance and mocking laughter at her distress. The girl, meanwhile, was trying to cover her hair with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Hey," Sarah called out, her voice carrying just enough authority to get their attention without seeming aggressive. "What's going on here?" The teenagers turned to look at her, some of them clearly annoyed at being interrupted. The leader of the group, a tall boy with perfectly styled hair and expensive clothes, stepped forward with a smirk. "Nothing you need to worry about, lady," he said dismissively. "Just having some fun with the weird girl." Sarah looked at the girl on the ground, then back at the group. "Fun usually involves everyone enjoying themselves," she said calmly. "Doesn't look like she's having much fun." The boy's smirk widened. "Look, we don't know who you are, but this isn't your business. Why don't you just keep walking?" Sarah felt the familiar calm that came over her in tense situations, the same feeling she did during countless operations where lives hung in the balance. But this wasn't a war zone, and these weren't enemy combatants. They were kids who had clearly never learned proper boundaries or consequences for their actions. "Actually," Sarah said, keeping her voice level, "when I see someone being hurt, it becomes my business." She knelt down next to the girl, ignoring the teenagers who were still filming. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. The girl looked up at her with red, puffy eyes. They cut my hair while I was sitting here waiting for my mom," she whispered. They said I looked stupid and they were just fixing it, but. Sarah felt anger building in her chest, but she kept it controlled. In the military, she had learned that anger without discipline was useless. Instead, she focused on helping the girl to her feet and brushing off her clothes. "What's your name?" Sarah asked. "Emma," the girl replied, still trying to hide her ruined hair. "Emma, my name is Sarah. Do you want to call your mom?" Before Emma could answer, the leader of the bullies stepped closer. "Look, lady, you need to mind your own business. This is between us and the freak." Sarah stood up slowly, turning to face him. For the first time, the boy seemed to notice that despite her casual appearance, there was something different about this woman. She carried herself with a confidence that suggested she wasn't intimidated by much, and her eyes had a hardness that spoke of experiences far beyond anything he could imagine. "I'm going to ask you once to apologize to Emma and delete those videos," Sarah said quietly. The boy laughed, though it sounded less confident than before. "Or what? You're going to call the cops? We're just kids having fun." "Or I'll handle this myself," Sarah replied, her voice still calm but carrying an undertone that made several of the other teenagers step back. The boy looked around at his friends, realizing he had an audience and feeling the need to maintain his tough image. "You know what, lady? You're as weird as she is. Maybe you need to learn some respect too." Before Sarah could respond, the boy reached out and shoved her shoulder, clearly expecting her to stumble or back down. Instead, Sarah barely moved, her body automatically shifting into a defensive stance that she had practiced thousands of times. The boy's confidence faltered as he realized his push had had almost no effect. "That was a mistake," Sarah said softly. What happened next occurred so quickly that the teenagers' phones barely captured it. Sarah's hand shot out, grabbing the boy's wrist and twisting it just enough to cause discomfort without real injury. At the same time, she stepped forward and swept his legs, sending him gently but firmly to the ground. It was a basic restraint technique, something she could do in her sleep, but to the watching teenagers, it looked like magic. The boy found himself sitting on the pavement, looking up at Sarah with shock and a growing sense of fear. His tough guy image had evaporated in seconds, replaced by the realization that he had seriously misjudged the situation. "Now," Sarah said, her voice still calm, "I believe you have something to say to Emma." The boy looked around at his friends, who were all staring at him with wide eyes. None of them moved to help him, and several had already started backing away. The dynamics of the group had shifted completely in just a few seconds. I'm sorry," the boy mumbled, not looking at Emma. "Look at her when you apologize," Sarah instructed. The boy reluctantly made eye contact with Emma. "I'm sorry we cut your hair. It wasn't right." Sarah nodded. "And the videos?" Without being asked twice, the boy pulled out his phone and started deleting the recordings. The other teenagers followed suit, suddenly, very eager to comply with whatever this mysterious woman wanted. As the bullies scattered, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared, Sarah turned back to Emma.
We must succeed.
The girl was staring at her with a mixture of awe and curiosity. "Are you like a martial arts expert or something?" Emma asked. Sarah smiled for the first time that morning. "I've had some training." "Are you hurt anywhere besides your hair?" Emma shook her head. "Just my feelings, I guess. They do this kind of stuff all the time, but today was worse than usual." "All the time?" Sarah asked, her protective instincts flaring again. "They think it's funny because I'm different," Emma explained. "I don't dress like them or talk like them, and I actually like school and reading. They call me weird and freak and things like that." Sarah felt her jaw tighten. Bullying was something she had zero tolerance for, especially when it targeted kids who were just trying to be themselves. In the military, she had fought against real enemies who posed genuine threats to innocent people. The idea of children terrorizing other children for entertainment struck her as particularly cowardly. "Where's your mom?" Sarah asked. "She's at work. I was supposed to wait here until she got off, but now." Emma gestured helplessly at her hair. Sarah looked at the girl's uneven, choppy haircut and made a decision. "Come with me," she said. "I know someone who can help fix this." She led Emma to her truck, a practical vehicle that drew no attention but was reliable and comfortable. As they drove through town, Emma gradually began to open up about her life. She was 16, lived with her single mother, and was one of the top students in her class. She loved to read, especially science fiction and fantasy novels, and she dreamed of becoming an engineer someday. The bullying had been going on for years, getting worse as she got older and, more obviously, different from her peers. "Have you told any adults about what's been happening?" Sarah asked. Emma shrugged. "The teachers at school say kids will be kids, and my mom has enough to worry about without me adding more problems. Besides, telling adults just makes the bullies worse later." Sarah understood the logic, even though it frustrated her. In many ways, Emma was trapped in a situation where she felt powerless to change her circumstances. It reminded Sarah of some of the civilians she had encountered during her military service, people caught in impossible situations through no fault of their own. They pulled up in front of a small beauty salon called Marla's Hair Studio. Sarah had noticed it during her previous trips to town but had never been inside. The owner, a woman in her 50s with bright purple hair, looked up in surprise as Sarah and Emma entered. "Hi there," the woman said, introducing herself as Marla. "What can I do for you ladies today?" Sarah explained the situation while Emma stood quietly beside her, still self-conscious about her appearance. Marla's expression grew increasingly angry as she heard about the bullying incident. "Those little monsters," Marla muttered. "I've heard about them causing trouble around town, but this is beyond anything I expected." She examined Emma's hair with professional eyes, her hands gentle as she assessed the damage. "Well, sweetie, they made a mess of it, but it's nothing I can't fix. We'll have to go shorter than your original length, but I can give you a style that will look intentional and beautiful." For the next hour, Sarah watched as Marla worked magic with scissors and styling tools. She and Emma talked about books, movies, and life in general, and Sarah found herself genuinely enjoying the conversation. Emma was intelligent, thoughtful, and surprisingly mature for her age. She reminded Sarah of some of the younger soldiers she had mentored during her career, bright people who just needed someone to believe in them. When Marla finished, Emma looked in the mirror and smiled for the first time since Sarah had met her. The haircut was stylish and modern, transforming what had been a cruel prank into something that actually enhanced her appearance. "You look beautiful," Sarah said honestly. Emma blushed. "Thank you. And thank you for helping me. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't shown up." As they prepared to leave the salon, Marla pulled Sarah aside. "That was a good thing you did today," she said quietly. "That girl has been through enough without having to deal with those bullies. But I should warn you, the kids you dealt with today come from some of the most influential families in town. You might want to be careful." Sarah nodded, though she wasn't particularly concerned about the social dynamics of small-town politics. She had faced down international terrorists and survived combat situations most people couldn't imagine. A group of privileged teenagers and their parents didn't worry her much. They drove back to where Emma's mother worked, a local diner called Betty's Kitchen. Emma's mother, a tired-looking woman named Linda, emerged from the kitchen when she saw them arrive. Her face showed immediate concern when she saw her daughter's new haircut. "What happened to your hair?" Linda asked. Emma quickly explained the situation, with Sarah filling in additional details. Linda's expression shifted from worry to anger to gratitude as she heard the full story. "I can't thank you enough," Linda said to Sarah. "Emma's been having trouble with those kids for years, but we've never been able to do anything about it. Their parents basically run this town." "Maybe it's time that changed," Sarah said quietly. Linda looked at her with new interest. "Are you new in town? I don't think I've seen you before." "I moved here a few months ago," Sarah explained. "I'm still getting used to how things work around here." "Well, you should know that the families of those kids don't like being challenged," Linda warned. "They have a lot of influence with the police, the school board, and pretty much everyone else who matters. They're not going to be happy about what happened today. Sarah had spent enough time in small communities during her military service to understand how local power structures worked. Often, a few families or individuals held disproportionate influence over everyone else, and they used that influence to protect their own interests and those of their children. It was a system that worked well for those at the top but left everyone else vulnerable. "I appreciate the warning," Sarah said. "But I'm not easily intimidated." As she drove home to her farmhouse, Sarah reflected on the day's events. She had come to Millbrook seeking peace and anonymity, but she was already getting involved in local conflicts. Part of her wondered if she should have just walked away, let someone else handle the situation. But a larger part of her knew she had done the right thing. Emma was just a kid trying to get through high school, and she deserved better than being terrorized by bullies. That evening, Sarah sat on her front porch watching the sunset and thinking about her next moves. She had a feeling that her encounter with the local bullies was just the beginning. In her experience, people who used their power to hurt others rarely stopped when challenged once. They usually escalated, bringing more resources to bear until they either got their way or were definitively defeated. The question was whether Sarah was ready for that kind of fight. She had come to Millbrook to escape conflict, not to create it. But she also knew that sometimes conflict found you regardless of your intentions. And, when it came to protecting innocent people from bullies, Sarah had never been able to walk away. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah made her decision. She would continue to live quietly and mind her own business as much as possible. But if those teenagers or their families decided to escalate the situation, they would discover that their new neighbor was far more than she appeared to be. They would learn, perhaps too late, that some fights are better avoided, and some people are more dangerous than they look. The small town of Millbrook was about to get very interesting. 3 days after the incident at the hardware store, Sarah was working in her garden when she heard the sound of vehicles approaching her farmhouse. She looked up to see 2 police cars pulling into her driveway, followed by an expensive black SUV. Her military training immediately kicked in, and she mentally noted the positions of all the vehicles, potential escape routes, and the tactical situation. 2 police officers emerged from the squad cars, followed by a well-dressed man in his 50s who stepped out of the SUV. Sarah recognized the type immediately: wealthy, powerful, used to getting his way through intimidation and influence. She had dealt with similar people during diplomatic missions overseas, local officials who thought their money and connections made them untouchable. Sarah wiped her hands on her gardening gloves and walked toward the group, maintaining a calm and friendly demeanor. She had learned long ago that the best way to handle confrontational situations was to appear cooperative while staying ready for anything. "Good afternoon, officers," she said with a polite smile. "How can I help you?" The older of the 2 policemen, a heavy-set man with graying hair, stepped forward. His badge identified him as Sergeant Williams. "Ms. Martinez, we need to talk to you about an incident that occurred 3 days ago involving some local teenagers." "Of course," Sarah replied. "Are you talking about when I helped a young girl who was being bullied?" The well-dressed man stepped forward before the sergeant could respond. "I'm Richard Blackwood," he announced, as if his name should mean something to Sarah. "My son tells me you assaulted him outside Frank's hardware store." Sarah kept her expression neutral, though internally she was analyzing Mr. Blackwood's approach. He was trying to establish dominance through intimidation, using the presence of police officers and his obvious wealth to make her feel vulnerable. It was a tactic she had seen many times before, and it never worked on her. "Your son was bullying a teenage girl," Sarah said calmly. "He had cut her hair without permission and was filming her humiliation. When he physically shoved me, I defended myself." "That's not how he tells it," Blackwood snapped. "He says you attacked him unprovoked and threatened him and his friends." Sergeant Williams looked uncomfortable, clearly caught between his duty to investigate complaints and his awareness that the Blackwood family's version of events might not be entirely accurate. Sarah could see the conflict in his expression and decided to make his job easier. "Officer, I'm sure you'll want to investigate this thoroughly," she said. "I'd suggest checking with the hardware store owner, Frank, who witnessed the entire incident. There may also be security cameras that recorded what happened." Sergeant Williams nodded. We've already spoken with Frank. His account matches yours, Ms. Martinez. Blackwood's face reddened slightly. Frank is an old man whose memory isn't what it used to be. My son is a good kid who's never been in trouble before. Sarah almost smiled at that claim. In her experience, bullies like Blackwood's son rarely limited their behavior to single incidents. They typically had long histories of targeting vulnerable people, but their parents' influence often kept them from facing consequences. Nevertheless, the sergeant continued, we have to take all complaints seriously. Mr. Blackwood alleges that you used excessive force against a minor. I used the minimum force necessary to stop him from escalating a violent situation, Sarah replied. Your son pushed me first, which constitutes assault. I simply prevented him from doing it again. The younger police officer, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Did anyone else see what happened? Several other teenagers were there filming, Sarah said. Though I believe they deleted their recordings when asked. Blackwood seized on this. See? She intimidated children into destroying evidence. That's obstruction of justice. Sarah felt her patience beginning to thin, but she kept her voice level. I asked them to delete recordings of a young girl's humiliation. That seems like basic human decency to me. The situation was clearly not going the way Blackwood had hoped. He had obviously expected to find an intimidated civilian who would back down when confronted by police and his social status. Instead, he was dealing with someone who remained calm under pressure and had her story straight. Look, Blackwood said, trying a different approach, maybe we can work this out without involving the legal system. I'm prepared to overlook this incident if you agree to stay away from my son and his friends. Sarah looked at him steadily. I have no interest in bothering your son or his friends. But, if I see them bullying other children, I'll intervene again. That sounds like a threat, Blackwood said. It's a promise, Sarah replied. The tension in the air was thick as the two faced each other. Sergeant Williams looked increasingly uncomfortable, while his younger partner seemed genuinely curious about how this unusual confrontation would play out. Ms. Martinez, the sergeant said carefully, Mr. Blackwood is an influential member of our community. His family has lived here for generations and contributes significantly to local charities and organizations. Sarah understood what he was really saying, that crossing the Blackwood family would have consequences beyond this immediate situation. It was meant as a warning, though she suspected the sergeant was trying to be helpful rather than threatening. I appreciate the information, Sergeant, Sarah said. I'm just trying to be a good neighbor. Blackwood laughed harshly. Good neighbors don't attack children and threaten families that have been part of this community for decades. Good neighbors don't raise children who think it's acceptable to terrorize other kids, Sarah replied evenly. The comment hit home, and Blackwood's carefully maintained composure began to crack. You don't know anything about my family or this community. You're an outsider who's been here for 5 minutes, and you think you can come in and tell us how to live? Sarah had heard variations of this argument before, usually from people who used tradition and family history to justify unacceptable behavior. During her military career, she had encountered corrupt officials who claimed their actions were justified by local customs or historical precedent. I've been here long enough to recognize bullying when I see it, she said. And, what exactly do you do for a living, Ms. Martinez? Blackwood asked, clearly trying to establish that she was somehow less important than he was. What qualifies you to judge how other people raise their children? Sarah considered her answer carefully. Her military service was classified, and her rank as a Navy SEAL general was not public information. She had moved to Millbrook specifically to avoid these kinds of conversations about her background. I'm retired, she said simply. Retired from what? Blackwood pressed. You're what, 35 years old? What could you possibly be retired from? The younger police officer was studying Sarah more carefully now, and she could see recognition beginning to dawn in his eyes. Something about her bearing, her physical condition, or her way of handling stress was triggering his training to identify military personnel. Ma'am, the young officer said carefully, are you former military? Sarah nodded. Navy. 15 years of service. What was your rate? He asked, using the Navy term for job classification. Sarah hesitated for a moment. Her actual position was classified, but she could give a partial truth. Special operations. The young officer's eyes widened slightly. Special operations in the Navy usually meant SEALs, and female SEALs were extremely rare. Sarah could see him reassessing everything about the situation. Blackwood, however, was unimpressed. So what? Lots of people serve in the military. That doesn't give you the right to assault children. Actually, sir, the young officer said carefully, special operations personnel receive extensive training in exactly the kind of situation that occurred. They're taught to use minimal force to neutralize threats while protecting innocent people. Sergeant Williams looked at his partner with mild annoyance, clearly wishing he would stop talking. The political dynamics of the situation were delicate enough without adding military credentials to the mix. The point is, Blackwood said, trying to regain control of the conversation, this woman attacked my son. I want her arrested and charged with assault. Mr. Blackwood, Sergeant Williams said diplomatically, based on the witness statements and the fact that your son admitted to pushing Ms. Martinez first, any assault charges would more likely be filed against him than against her. Blackwood's face turned red with anger and frustration. He clearly hadn't expected his complaint to be taken seriously by the police, especially with his family's influence in the community. This is ridiculous, he snapped. My son is a minor who was defending himself against an adult who attacked him for no reason. Your son was participating in criminal harassment of another minor, Sarah pointed out. Cutting someone's hair without permission is assault. Filming it for humiliation purposes could be considered a hate crime, depending on the circumstances. The legal knowledge impressed both police officers, though it clearly didn't improve Blackwood's mood. He was beginning to realize that his attempt at intimidation had backfired spectacularly. I think we've heard enough, Sergeant Williams said. Mr. Blackwood, based on our investigation, we won't be filing charges against Ms. Martinez. If you want to pursue this further, you'll need to speak with the district attorney's office. You can bet I will, Blackwood said angrily. This isn't over. As the police officers returned to their cars, Blackwood lingered for a moment, clearly wanting to say something more to Sarah. She waited patiently, curious about what his next move would be. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into, he said quietly, his voice carrying a hint of genuine threat. My family has connections throughout this state. We own businesses, we know judges, we contribute to political campaigns. Cross us, and you'll find life in this town very difficult. Sarah looked at him steadily. Mr. Blackwood, I've been threatened by international terrorists, war criminals, and dictators. Your local political connections don't particularly worry me. The comment was delivered so matter-of-factly that it took Blackwood a moment to process it. When he did, his expression shifted from anger to uncertainty. For the first time, he was beginning to suspect that he might have seriously misjudged his opponent. Just stay away from my family, he said finally, turning to leave. As long as your family stays away from innocent children, we won't have any problems, Sarah replied. After the visitors left, Sarah returned to her garden, but her mind was no longer on plants and soil. The confrontation had been predictable, but it also represented an escalation. Blackwood's threats suggested that he wasn't going to let the incident go, and his mention of connections throughout the state indicated that he had the resources to make good on his warnings. In military terms, Sarah was now engaged in a conflict whether she wanted to be or not. The question was how far Blackwood would be willing to take it, and what resources he would bring to bear. Sarah had faced much more dangerous opponents, but she had also been operating with the full backing of the United States government. As a private civilian in a small town, her options were more limited. That evening, Sarah received a phone call from Linda, Emma's mother. Sarah, I wanted to thank you again for helping Emma, Linda said. But I also wanted to warn you. I heard that Richard Blackwood went to see you today with the police. Word travels fast in small towns, Sarah observed. Emma's been so much happier since you helped her, Linda continued. But I'm worried about what might happen next. The Blackwood family doesn't like being challenged, and they have ways of making life difficult for people who cross them. Sarah appreciated the warning, even though it didn't change her perspective on the situation. I can take care of myself, Linda. But you and Emma should be careful. Sometimes when bullies can't get to their primary target, they go after easier ones. What do you mean? I mean that if Blackwood can't intimidate me directly, he might try to use pressure on Emma or you to get to me. Make sure Emma knows to tell you if anything unusual happens at school or anywhere else. Linda was quiet for a moment. You really think he'd go after a teenage girl just to get back at you? In my experience, people who abuse their power to protect bullies are capable of almost anything, Sarah said. Just be aware of your surroundings and trust your instincts. After the call ended, Sarah walked through her farmhouse, automatically checking locks and sightlines. Old habits from her military days were reasserting themselves, triggered by the sense that she was now in a tactical situation that required vigilance. She had come to Millbrook to escape conflict and live quietly, but conflict had found her anyway. The difference was that this time, the stakes were lower but more personal. In the military, she had fought for abstract concepts like national security and international stability. Here, she was fighting for one teenage girl's right to go to school without being terrorized. In some ways, the smaller scale made the conflict more meaningful. Sarah had seen enough of the world to know that most evil wasn't committed by monsters or terrorists. It was committed by ordinary people who used their power to hurt others and who counted on everyone else being too afraid or too apathetic to stop them. Richard Blackwood and his son represented exactly that kind of everyday evil. They weren't planning to overthrow governments or commit mass casualties, but they were making life miserable for innocent people and using their influence to avoid consequences. In Sarah's view, that made them enemies worth fighting. The question was what form that fight would take. Sarah hoped it would remain civilized, resolved through legal channels and community pressure. But she was prepared for it to escalate beyond that if necessary. She had not survived 15 years of military service, including 8 years as a Navy SEAL, by backing down from bullies. As she settled in for the night, Sarah began making mental preparations for whatever would come next. She reviewed her resources, her vulnerabilities, and her strategic options. She thought about potential allies in the community and possible ways that Blackwood might try to retaliate. Most importantly, she reminded herself why this fight mattered. Emma was just one girl in one small town, but she represented all the victims of bullies who had no one to stand up for them. For Sarah, that made the fight worth having, regardless of the personal cost. The war was just beginning. 2 weeks after the confrontation with Richard Blackwood and the police, Sarah began to understand exactly what he had meant by his threats. The campaign against her started subtly, in ways that could easily be dismissed as coincidence by anyone who wasn't trained to recognize coordinated harassment. First, her electricity was shut off for routine maintenance that somehow took 3 days to complete. When she called the utility company, she was told that there had been a mistake in their records, but the repair crew couldn't come out until the following week. Sarah had lived in enough remote locations during her military career to be prepared for such inconveniences, but the timing seemed too convenient to be accidental. Next, her mail delivery stopped. When she inquired at the post office, she was told that there had been complaints about her dog being aggressive toward postal workers. Sarah didn't have a dog. When she pointed this out, the postal supervisor looked confused and promised to investigate, but her mail delivery remained suspended. The local bank called to inform her that her account had been flagged for suspicious activity and would be frozen pending an investigation. The suspicious activity turned out to be her monthly pension deposit from the Navy, which the bank claimed looked like it might be fraudulent. Sarah had to drive to the state capitol to resolve the issue, losing 2 days and considerable effort to straighten out what should have been a simple misunderstanding. Each incident, taken individually, could be explained as bureaucratic incompetence or bad luck. But Sarah recognized the pattern. Someone with influence was making phone calls, pulling strings, and using their connections to make her life as difficult as possible. It was a sophisticated campaign of harassment designed to convince her that staying in Millbrook would be more trouble than it was worth. Sarah had to admit it was well executed. Richard Blackwood clearly understood how to use his influence effectively, applying pressure through multiple channels simultaneously. In other circumstances, Sarah might have been impressed by the coordination and thoroughness of the effort. Unfortunately for Blackwood, he had chosen the wrong target. Sarah had endured much worse inconveniences during her military career, often while under actual enemy fire. Having her electricity shut off and her mail delayed was annoying but hardly devastating. If anything, it reminded her of some of the more challenging training exercises she had completed as a SEAL. What bothered Sarah more than the harassment itself was what it revealed about the power structure in Millbrook. For Blackwood to coordinate this kind of campaign, he needed allies in multiple institutions. The utility company, the post office, and the bank had all acted on his behalf, either willingly or unknowingly. That suggested a level of influence that went beyond simple wealth and extended into genuine corruption. Sarah was contemplating her response options when Emma appeared at her front door one afternoon. The teenager looked upset, and Sarah immediately invited her inside. "I think something bad is happening," Emma said without preamble. "And I think it's because you helped me." Sarah poured 2 glasses of iced tea and sat down across from Emma at her kitchen table. "What makes you think that?" "Everything's gotten worse at school," Emma explained. "Before, it was just Mason and his friends who bothered me. Now it's like the teachers are doing it too." Mason, Sarah learned, was Richard Blackwood's son, the ringleader of the bullying incident at the hardware store. Emma described how he had been spreading rumors about her, telling people that she had lied about being attacked and that she had convinced a crazy woman to assault innocent students. "That's bad enough," Emma continued, "but now some of the teachers are treating me differently too. Mrs. Henderson, who used to be nice to me, accused me of cheating on a test yesterday. She said my answers were too good for someone like me." Sarah felt her anger building but kept her expression calm. "Someone like you?" "She said I didn't have the background or intelligence to answer questions about advanced mathematics without cheating. She made me take the test again in front of the whole class, and when I got the same score, she said I must have memorized the answers somehow." The story got worse. Emma's guidance counselor had called her into his office to suggest that she might be happier at a different school, perhaps one better suited to students with her particular challenges. When Emma asked what challenges he was referring to, he became vague and dismissive, but the message was clear: she was no longer welcome. "It's like everyone got together and decided I was a problem that needed to go away," Emma said, tears forming in her eyes. "And I think it's because you stood up for me. They're punishing you by making my life miserable." Sarah had suspected that Blackwood might try to use Emma as leverage against her, but she had underestimated how quickly and thoroughly he could mobilize the school system. The coordination suggested that his influence extended much deeper into the community than she had initially realized. "Emma," Sarah said carefully, "I want you to know that none of this is your fault. You didn't do anything wrong, and you don't deserve to be treated this way. But if I hadn't been at the hardware store that day, if you hadn't helped me, none of this would be happening," Emma protested. "If I hadn't helped you, those bullies would have just moved on to their next victim," Sarah replied. "This was never about you specifically. It's about people who use their power to hurt others and who get angry when someone stands up to them." Emma looked up at her with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "So what can we do about it?" Sarah had been asking herself the same question. Her military training suggested several approaches, but most of them were inappropriate for a civilian situation. She couldn't conduct surveillance on Blackwood or sabotage his business interests. She couldn't use military contacts to pressure him through official channels. She was operating as a private citizen with limited resources and legal constraints. "We document everything," Sarah said finally. "Every incident, every conversation, every time someone treats you unfairly. We build a record of what's happening. And then, what? Then, we decide what to do with that evidence." That evening, Sarah drove to the state capitol to meet with someone who might be able to help. Special Agent Jennifer Torres worked for the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, and she had been one of Sarah's contacts during her military career. Their paths had crossed during several joint operations, and Sarah had come to respect Torres's intelligence and integrity. They met at a small restaurant away from downtown, where they were unlikely to be recognized or overheard. Torres listened carefully as Sarah explained the situation, asking occasional questions but mostly just absorbing the information. "So let me get this straight," Torres said when Sarah finished. "You intervened in a bullying incident, and now the victim's family is being systematically harassed by school officials who are apparently acting on behalf of the bully's influential father." "That's the situation as I understand it." Torres leaned back in her chair, thinking. "The harassment you're experiencing could potentially be investigated as civil rights violations, especially if they're based on your military service. But proving coordination and intent would be difficult." "What about Emma's situation at school?" "That's more complicated. Unless we can prove that school officials are acting on direct orders from Blackwood, it's hard to distinguish between corruption and ordinary unfairness. Schools have a lot of discretion in how they treat students." Sarah had expected as much. The beauty of Blackwood's approach was that each individual action was defensible, even if the overall pattern was clearly harassment. It would be difficult to prove in court without inside witnesses or documented communications. However, Torres continued, there might be another angle. "Has anyone suggested that you leave town? Have you received any direct threats?" Sarah described her conversations with both Sergeant Williams and Richard Blackwood himself, including Blackwood's comment about having connections throughout the state and his warning that life in Millbrook would become difficult. Torres made notes as she listened. That could potentially be considered extortion or intimidation, especially given the harassment campaign that followed. The problem is proving that Blackwood is behind the specific incidents. They discussed various investigative approaches, but Torres was honest about the limitations. The FBI's Public Corruption Unit was focused on larger cases involving federal crimes or widespread systemic corruption. A small-town influence campaign, however unethical, might not rise to the level of federal intervention. "I'll make some inquiries," Torres promised. "See what we can find out about Blackwood's business dealings and political connections. Sometimes people who abuse their power in one area are doing it in others too." As they prepared to leave, Torres offered a warning. "Be careful, Sarah. You're not operating with military backup anymore. If this escalates beyond harassment and bureaucratic games, you'll be on your own." Sarah appreciated the concern, but she had already considered that reality. She was no longer a Navy SEAL general with the full resources of the U.S. military behind her. She was a private citizen in a small town, dealing with local corruption and influence peddling. Her training and experience gave her advantages, but they also came with limitations. The drive back to Millbrook gave Sarah time to think about her strategic situation. She was fighting on unfamiliar terrain against an opponent who understood the local power structure better than she did. Blackwood had home field advantage, established relationships, and the presumption of legitimacy that came with being a longtime community member. On the other hand, Sarah had skills and experience that Blackwood couldn't match. She understood conflict escalation, tactical planning, and psychological warfare. She had operated in hostile environments where the stakes were much higher than small-town politics. Most importantly, she had the discipline to stay focused on her objectives regardless of personal inconvenience. Her primary objective was simple: protect Emma and other vulnerable students from systematic harassment. Secondary objectives included exposing the corruption that enabled such harassment and ensuring that bullies like Mason Blackwood faced appropriate consequences for their actions. Sarah was also beginning to formulate a longer-term objective: dismantling Richard Blackwood's ability to abuse his influence. If he was willing to mobilize the entire school system to retaliate against a teenage girl, he was clearly a threat to anyone who might challenge him in the future. Removing that threat would serve the broader community, even if most people didn't initially understand the benefit. When Sarah arrived back at her farmhouse, she found a surprise waiting for her. Someone had spray-painted "Go Home" across her front door in red letters. The message was crude but clear, and it represented an escalation from bureaucratic harassment to direct intimidation. Sarah examined the vandalism carefully, looking for any evidence that might identify the perpetrator. The paint was fresh, applied within the last few hours based on the degree of drying. The writing was sloppy, suggesting it had been done quickly, probably after dark. There were no footprints or other obvious clues, but Sarah photographed everything thoroughly before cleaning it off. The vandalism confirmed that the situation was escalating beyond subtle pressure campaigns. Someone was becoming impatient with the slow pace of harassment and had decided to send a more direct message. Whether it was Blackwood himself, his son, or someone else acting on their behalf, the incident represented a tactical error. Sarah had been operating defensively up to this point, responding to harassment and documenting incidents. But vandalism was a crime that could be investigated and prosecuted. More importantly, it suggested that her opponents were becoming frustrated and potentially reckless. In Sarah's experience, frustrated opponents made mistakes. They abandoned careful planning in favor of emotional responses, and they often revealed more about their capabilities and intentions than they intended. The spray-painted message was crude and impulsive, suggesting that whoever was behind it was not thinking strategically. As she cleaned the paint off her door, Sarah began planning her next moves. The defensive phase of the conflict was ending, and it was time to take the initiative. She had given her opponents multiple opportunities to de-escalate the situation, and they had chosen to intensify their attacks instead. It was time to remind them that they had seriously underestimated their opponent. Sarah Martinez was not just a retired military officer seeking a quiet life in the countryside. She was a Navy SEAL general who had spent years learning how to neutralize threats to innocent people. The skills that had served her in combat zones around the world were about to be applied to the corrupted power structure of Millbrook. The war was about to begin in earnest. The turning point came when Emma didn't show up for their scheduled meeting at the library. Sarah had been helping the teenager with college application essays, using the sessions as both educational support and intelligence gathering about the ongoing harassment campaign. When Emma failed to appear and didn't answer her phone, Sarah's instincts told her something was seriously wrong. Sarah drove to the high school, arriving just as classes were letting out. She spotted Emma's friend Jessica in the crowd of students and approached her carefully, aware that any association with Sarah might make Jessica a target as well. "Have you seen Emma today?" Sarah asked quietly. Jessica looked around nervously before answering. "She's in the hospital. They say she fell down the stairs at school, but..." She hesitated, clearly afraid to say more in public. "But what? Emma doesn't fall downstairs. She's like the most careful person I know. And the stairs where it happened, they're not even that steep or slippery or anything." Sarah felt cold anger settling in her chest. "Which hospital?" "Millbrook General. But visiting hours are over, and they're only letting family in to see her." Sarah thanked Jessica and drove immediately to the hospital. She had no intention of letting visiting hours or family restrictions stop her from checking on Emma, but she needed to approach the situation carefully. Hospitals had security protocols that could complicate unauthorized visits. At the hospital, Sarah found Linda sitting in the emergency department waiting area, looking exhausted and worried. Her eyes were red from crying, and she clutched a cup of cold coffee with shaking hands. "Linda," Sarah said softly, sitting down beside her. "How is she?" "Concussion, 3 broken ribs, and a dislocated shoulder," Linda replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "They say she fell down the main staircase at school during lunch break." "Do you believe that?" Linda looked at Sarah with eyes full of pain and anger. "Emma has been going up and down those stairs for 4 years. She knows every step, every railing, every uneven spot. And even if she did fall, how does someone get injured that badly from falling down 12 steps?" Sarah had seen enough combat injuries to know that the pattern of damage Linda described was not consistent with a simple fall downstairs. Broken ribs and a dislocated shoulder suggested impact from multiple angles, more like what would result from being pushed or beaten. "Did anyone see what happened?" "The school says no. They claim she was alone in the stairwell during lunch, and someone found her at the bottom a few minutes later. But Emma told me, before they gave her pain medication," she said Mason and his friends cornered her. she said they. Linda's voice broke, and she couldn't continue. Sarah waited patiently while Linda composed herself. She was beginning to understand that the harassment campaign had escalated far beyond what she had anticipated. If Emma had been deliberately injured, the situation had crossed the line from bullying and intimidation into serious criminal territory. She said they pushed her, Linda finally continued. Mason told her it was a message for the crazy lady who thought she could protect her. Then, they shoved her down the stairs and walked away. Sarah felt her military training taking over, the cold analytical mindset that had served her in combat situations. Emma's assault was not just an attack on an innocent teenager, it was a direct challenge to Sarah herself. The message was clear: Blackwood and his allies were willing to seriously injure children to make their point. "Have you talked to the police?" Linda laughed bitterly. Sergeant Williams came by earlier. He took Emma's statement, but, he said without witnesses or evidence, it would be her word against 4 other students. He suggested that maybe Emma was confused because of her head injury. Sarah understood the implication. Even with clear evidence of deliberate assault, the police were unwilling to challenge the Blackwood family's version of events. The level of corruption and intimidation was deeper than she had initially realized. "Can I see her? Visiting hours are over, and they're being really strict about family only. I think someone made a call to make sure you specifically couldn't get in." Another demonstration of the Blackwood family's reach and influence. They had anticipated that Sarah would try to visit Emma and had taken steps to prevent it. The level of coordination required for such actions suggested that this was not a spontaneous retaliation but part of a planned escalation. Sarah made a decision that would have significant consequences for everyone involved. "Linda, I need you to listen to me carefully. What happened to Emma is not going to stand. But, before I take action, I need you to understand what that might mean." Linda looked at her with confusion and hope. "What are you talking about?" "I haven't been completely honest about my background," Sarah said. "I told you I was retired military, but I didn't explain what that meant. I'm not just a former soldier. I'm a Navy SEAL, and I held the rank of general. I spent 15 years in special operations, and I know how to handle situations like this." Linda stared at her in shock. Navy SEALs were legendary even among civilians, known for their elite training and dangerous missions. The idea that the quiet woman who had been helping her daughter was actually one of the most highly trained warriors in the world was almost impossible to process. "You're serious," Linda said finally. "Completely serious. And I'm telling you this because what comes next is going to be very different from anything that's happened so far. The Blackwood family thinks they can intimidate and hurt innocent people without consequences. They're about to learn how wrong they are. What are you going to do?" Sarah stood up, her entire demeanor shifting in a way that would have been familiar to anyone who had served under her command. The friendly neighbor and helpful civilian was being replaced by the tactical operator who had led classified missions in hostile territory. "I'm going to teach them why attacking children under my protection is the worst mistake they could possibly make." Sarah left the hospital and drove directly to the Blackwood family's estate, a sprawling property on the outskirts of Millbrook that showcased their wealth and influence. The house was a modern mansion surrounded by manicured gardens and protected by an expensive security system. Sarah parked at the front gate and waited. At exactly 9 p.m., Richard Blackwood's Mercedes pulled through the gate, returning from whatever evening meeting or social event had occupied his time while Emma lay injured in the hospital. Sarah followed the car up the winding driveway and parked directly behind it, blocking its path to the garage. Blackwood emerged from his car looking angry and confused. "What the hell are you doing on my property?" "We need to talk," Sarah said calmly, getting out of her truck. "I've got nothing to say to you. Get off my land before I call the police." "Go ahead and call them," Sarah replied. "Tell them you want to report the Navy SEAL general whose protection you just attacked through a teenage girl." Blackwood's expression changed from anger to uncertainty. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about Emma Martinez, who is currently in the hospital with injuries that your son and his friends inflicted to send me a message."
I'm talking about the end of your little campaign of harassment and intimidation.
For the first time since she had met him, Blackwood looked genuinely nervous.
I don't know anything about any girl being hurt. If something happened at school, that's between the students involved.
Sarah stepped closer, and Blackwood instinctively backed toward his front door. Her movements were controlled and deliberate, carrying the unmistakable aura of someone who had spent years in life-or-death situations. "Let me be very clear about something," Sarah said, her voice carrying a quiet intensity that made every word feel dangerous. "I am a Navy SEAL general."
Do you understand what that means?
Blackwood didn't answer, but his expression suggested he was beginning to grasp the magnitude of his mistake.
It means I have spent the last 15 years learning how to neutralize threats to innocent people using any means necessary.
It means I have skills and experience that your local power structure can't protect you from. It means that attacking children under my protection is the stupidest thing you could possibly do." Sarah continued her advance, and Blackwood continued his retreat until his back was against his front door.
"Now, here's what's going to happen.
Your son and his friends are going to confess to what they did to Emma. You're going to use your influence to make sure they face appropriate consequences. The harassment campaign against Emma, her mother, and me is going to stop immediately." "You can't threaten me on my own property," Blackwood protested, but his voice lacked conviction.
"I'm not threatening you," Sarah replied. "I'm explaining the new reality.
You thought you were dealing with an ordinary civilian who would be intimidated by your money and connections. Instead, you're dealing with someone who has spent her career hunting down people who hurt innocent victims." The front door opened behind Blackwood, and his wife appeared, drawn by the sound of voices. She took one look at the situation and immediately understood that her husband was in serious trouble.
"Richard, what's going on?" she asked nervously.
"Mrs. Blackwood," Sarah said politely, "your husband's son put a teenage girl in the hospital today to send me a message. I'm here to explain why that was a serious mistake."
Mrs. Blackwood looked between Sarah and her husband, clearly trying to process what she was hearing. "Mason hurt someone?"
3 broken ribs, a concussion, and a dislocated shoulder," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "All because your family decided that intimidating a Navy SEAL general was a good idea."
The impact of Sarah's revelation was immediate and decisive.
Mrs. Blackwood went pale, and even Richard seemed to understand that the situation had escalated far beyond his ability to control it through normal channels. "You have 24 hours to resolve this situation," Sarah continued.
"Emma's attackers confess and face consequences, the harassment stops, and your family learns to leave innocent people alone. If that doesn't happen, I'll handle the situation myself." "What does that mean?" Richard asked.
Sarah smiled, and, for the first time, it wasn't a friendly expression.
"It means you'll discover exactly why the Navy trusted me to handle problems that regular law enforcement couldn't solve."
Without waiting for a response, Sarah turned and walked back to her truck. As she drove away, she could see the Blackwood family standing in their doorway, finally, understanding that they had picked a fight with someone far more dangerous than they had imagined. The next morning, Sarah received 3 phone calls that confirmed her message had been received and understood. First, Sergeant Williams called to inform her that 4 students had voluntarily come to the police station to confess to assaulting Emma Martinez. They would be charged with aggravated assault and would face both criminal prosecution and expulsion from school. Second, the hospital called to tell her that Emma's medical bills had been paid in full by an anonymous donor, and that private rooms and additional care had been arranged for her recovery. Third, Linda called to tell her that the school superintendent had personally visited Emma in the hospital to apologize for the failure of school security and to promise that the students responsible would face the maximum possible consequences. When Sarah visited Emma later that day, she found the teenager sitting up in bed, bruised but alert, with her mother beside her.
"I heard what you did," Emma said quietly.
"Jessica told me her boyfriend heard Mason and his friends confessing to the police this morning. They looked scared." "They should be scared," Sarah replied. "What they did was criminal assault, and they're going to face real consequences for it."
"But how did you make it happen so fast? Yesterday everyone was saying it was just an accident." Sarah sat down in the chair next to Emma's bed. Sometimes bullies only understand one kind of language.
When they finally met someone who spoke it fluently, they decided cooperation was their best option.
Emma was quiet for a moment, thinking about everything that had happened. Are you really a Navy SEAL?
I am. And, more importantly, you're under my protection now.
Anyone who wants to hurt you will have to go through me first.
The relief on Emma's face was worth everything Sarah had risked to achieve it. For the first time in years, the teenager looked genuinely safe and protected. 3 months later, Sarah received a letter from Emma, who had been accepted to MIT with a full scholarship. The teenager was thriving academically and, socially, free from the harassment that had defined her high school experience. Mason Blackwood and his friends had been sentenced to community service and counseling, while Richard Blackwood had quietly sold his business interests and moved his family to another state. Sarah Martinez remained in Millbrook, where she was known as a helpful neighbor who had once served in the military. Most people never learned the full truth about her background or the extent of what she had done to protect one innocent teenager.
But they didn't need to know.
It was enough that bullies and predators throughout the region understood that Millbrook was now under the protection of someone who would not tolerate their behavior. Emma's letter included a photo of her in her MIT dorm room, smiling and confident, surrounded by new friends who appreciated her intelligence and kindness. On the back, she had written a simple message: "Thank you for teaching me that sometimes the best way to stay silent is to let your actions speak for themselves." Sarah kept the letter on her kitchen table, a reminder of why some fights are worth having, regardless of the personal cost. She had come to Millbrook seeking peace and anonymity, but she had found something more valuable: the opportunity to use her skills to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves. In the end, that was what being a Navy SEAL had always been about. Not the classified missions or the elite training, but the simple commitment to stand between innocent people and those who would harm them. Sarah had carried that commitment from the battlefields of distant countries to the hallways of a small-town high school, and she would carry it wherever life took her next. The quiet war was over, and the good guys had won.